In this episode, we sit down with Mark Logan, Chief Entrepreneurial Advisor to the Scottish Government and former Chief Operating Officer of Skyscanner. We talk about scaling businesses, creating a sense of agency, and how to simplify complex decision making. Having seen Mark talk many times, I've seen firsthand his ability to simplify difficult structures, to lead with confidence, and really emphasise communication. Enjoy the conversation. Welcome to Tag Lab, Mark. We're absolutely delighted to have you here today. So today we are going to talk about different aspects of business, scaling, starting businesses, all the difficult bits, and learn from your insights and different approaches over the years. And I wanted to kick us off talking about the scale up and startup journey. And I've heard you speak multiple times and I'm always fascinated by all of your stories and insights. One of the concepts that's really stuck with me since the last time we met was the concept of optimising for agency and how you do that in companies, whether it's structures, decision-making, bottlenecks, all of these different types of things. So I wondered if you could start talking a little bit about that concept and how that's successful.
Yeah, certainly. So maybe the place to start with that question is whenever we make an organisational change, small, large, in between, do we ever ask ourselves, what are we optimizing for in this change? It's important to think about your organization and any change you make to it as an engineering problem, essentially. And normally when we think about engineering problems in various fields of human endeavor, we always explicitly know what we're optimizing for when we're building something or designing something, etc. I like to use the analogy of, if you're building a car, if it's a sports car, you're optimizing for speed. If it's a people carrier, you're optimizing for space, and speed's not so important. So that's a very intuitive concept for us. But for some reason, when we think about our own organizations and making change, we very rarely, in my experience, having spoke to quite a lot of people about this, we very rarely explicitly know what it is we're optimizing for in that change. We might be changing the organization because we feel it doesn't work anymore or the team's got bigger, but we don't say, and I'm trying to optimize this attribute of my organization. And because of that, we often end up optimizing for the wrong things. So we optimize for a nice looking structure chart, or we optimize for politics because we don't want to offend somebody who wants, someone reporting into them and all that stuff. Or we optimize for status. I've got more people reporting to me, so I feel more important. And those things are unlikely to lead to a high-performing organization, except by coincidence. So I prefer to take the view that we need to be clear what we're optimizing for. And the thing I suggest that we should be optimizing for is agency. Now let's just define agency here in this context. Agency essentially is the ability for each individual in the organization, especially frontline staff who actually do the work that touches customers directly. Agency is their ability to do that job with the skills they need to do it, properly aligned to the strategy of the company, with a clear sense of what they own and what they don't own, and with access to the necessary resources to carry out that job if they don't personally have those resources. So, a number of elements there, but you tend to find that when you grow an organization, we tend to have one or more of those attributes in deficit. I can't get access to the design team because they're busy, and therefore I'm sort of stuck. Or the company's grown and I'm no longer competent at managing a team that's bigger than I used to manage, so I can't do the job. Or I'm not really sure what the strategy is around here, or those kind of things. We tend to find that as we grow the organization, one of those aspects of agency or more tends to diminish, and then that eventually affects our ability overall in the company to get things done the speed we used to. So agency to me is the North Star with which, when it comes to organizational design, you should navigate.
And where are you starting from when you think, okay, we are going to be a company that optimizes for agency? Does it start from the structure, or are you interviewing staff to see what decisions are holding them back? Like, what's the kind of order of events that you would be doing that in?
Well, you mentioned structure, so let's put structure in context. An organization really is three elements. It's the structure you ask people to operate within. It's the processes that you ask them to operate within or around that structure, and it's their own personal capacity to carry out the job that you want them to carry out. And therefore, it's wrong to focus on structure per se. It's better to start with agency and say, is agency being affected by some issue in isolation or in combination across your structure, process, and current ability to do the job that I'm being asked to do? And that will almost always require you to make changes, not just to structure, but also to process and to the skill sets that people have. And sometimes it will require you to change the people that you have in certain circumstances. So where to start is a great question. I like to start with the following thought experiment. Imagine that you and I had started a company and we'd hired a couple of employees. So you take like employee number 4, for example. Now, let's look at her agency. First of all, she's very aligned to the strategy of the business because she sits next to us and we talk all the time. So we've got no alignment issue. Secondly, she knows what she owns in the business. There's only 4 of us, and she might be the VP of engineering, the VP of product. So she's very clear on her delineated ownership, and she knows where to go and get a response. If she doesn't know, she's very close to the customer's needs because we're all facing the customer. And at this relatively small scale of the business, she's competent to do the job we've hired her to do. Now, if you then jump forward to, say, employee 204, then things are very different. First of all, you and I are way too busy now to spend time talking to employee 204 beyond a cursory welcome to the company sort of introduction. So to understand the strategy, she has to go through a slide pack that the HR team gave her that's 6 months out of date. So she's not really sure what we're trying to do. She's not really sure what she owns in the business because a couple of other people think they also own partly overlapping areas with hers. So she's got to go and negotiate with them before she can start to do things, etc. Now, if the business starts to then grow, and we were asking her to manage a team of 3 people, but a bit further down the line, she's now managing a team of 10 people, then her ability to manage that team is not guaranteed. And if we haven't invested in that, then she'll now no longer be competent to do the job that we hired her to do. So you can see that if we were to give employee 4 an index of 100 for agency just to set a benchmark, it's clear that employee 204 is somewhere below that level. So when it comes to where do you start, a good place to start is to try to assess what you think the agency of your frontline people is in the terms I've just described, and then ask yourself, what's driving it to that level and what could we do about it to make it better. So that obviously we can then go into techniques about how you discover that, but that's a very good sort of way to think about the problem. Don't start with the structure charts wrong. Start with what's the agency of my people as represented by alignment, competence, ownership and access to the resources that you need to do the job. And you'll probably find that they are not all at optimum levels. And that's where you start thinking about organisational design.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And do you have frameworks that you use to test that within an organisation, and then maybe speak to any examples of companies that you've taken to kind of change that approach and their journey in optimising for agency?
Well, the approach I take is, this takes us on to an interesting topic. We all talk about metrics, and there's a famous saying that you can't manage what you can't measure. And I don't like that term. I don't agree with that statement because there's a lot of things you can't measure, but you'd still like to have some insight into them without putting a number on them. So let's take a concrete example in the context of this discussion. One of the most valuable quantities in a business is the frustration level of the business. Now, what I mean by that is that when an organisation starts to hit problems, you start to find you can do less than you used to do, or something like that, or you've hired a bunch more people but you're not getting more done, very, very common sort of pathologies, then what you tend to find is that your frontline people, and especially your best people, become frustrated before that shows up in your numbers. So somebody who used to be very enthusiastic now seems a bit cynical, or something like that. Or people start telling you that that gifted employee needs to be fired because they're just too awkward nowadays. They just seem angry. Now, these are indicators that frustration levels are rising in your business. And frustration levels amongst your best people rising is usually an indicator that agency is falling. Something's changing in the business. Usually you're hiring more people and the structures aren't working anymore for that scale, or the processes don't work at that scale, or you haven't invested in the competence of your managers at different levels of scale. Very common issue. So people are getting frustrated because they can't release software as fast as used to. They can't support customers as well as they used to, etc., etc. So that then begs the question: well, how do you measure frustration? And as I said earlier, essentially you can't measure it in quantitative terms, or you can't point a gadget in the room of staff and get a readout. So this is why taking a qualitative approach to certain metrics is really valuable, which is, I don't know what the current level is, but I can tell you if it's changed. I can feel if it's gone up or gone down. A very good way to monitor frustration in those pragmatic terms is regularly talk to the people at the front of your business who are facing the customers in all the different ways that people do that. So I like to call them the frontline employees. Talk to them regularly, establish a sort of culture in the company that the CEO, the founder, or someone in a similar senior role regularly sits down and just asks you what should I be worried about, or what frustrates you, or how do you feel things are going? What would make you feel more able to perform at a high level? All these kind of questions, open questions about how it feels to operate in this society of the company that we created. Now, you can't do that when things have gone wrong, because people are on guard. Perhaps you've met with me to fire me is a common kind of concern. So you have to normalize asking regularly when times are okay. And then your job as a manager is to detect a change in how people communicate with you. And it's not that you are taking everything people say at face value, because people have their own agendas, or they don't have an overview of the business, or they're inexperienced. What you're looking for is a change in the signal. So, for example, if you talk to me every 2-3 weeks, just a casual chat about the business, and we have some humour and we joke, etc., it's quite relaxed. But then you find I've become more polite with you, then that's an indicator that I'm angry at you and I'm self-editing, because I don't want to say the wrong thing to the boss. So these little clues, or I start to say things like, the folks in floor 2 are just idiots. They just don't understand this business. That's a common response from humans. We tend to anthropomorphize blame it on people rather than the system. So you're looking for changes in the signal, and that tells you that frustration is rising, which means you're probably hitting a point, or what I call an inflection point in the development of the business, that you're going to see productivity start to slide. Now, then you've got to diagnose, why that's happening, which we can perhaps come on to. But that basic framework was how I navigated my ship. Initially, when I didn't have the model, I did that implicitly, based on an instinct that you've got to empower the frontline people in your business. But later I started to sort of build that sort of model of it in my own mind, so that I could more easily apply that.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I went through an exercise myself maybe a year ago of taking just a cross section of 10 people in the company and saying, what do you like about working here? What do you not like about working here? What would you change tomorrow if you were me? Because I felt probably like that. There was people being hired and I just didn't know them in the same way. And it was just amazing, the insight that I got. But like you say, you need to do it I'm probably doing it every 6 months, and then you get the good times, the bad times, but you're getting a really good cross section of opinion. And like you say, there's sometimes just a feeling, like the energy is good or it's not so good, and it's trying to dig into that, but not always putting a specific number on it. So yeah, I think that's really helpful in terms of recognizing the communication style of your your really influential people as well, because it's whenever one influential person starts to behave a certain way, then I think that just starts to flow through the organisation. So being attuned to that. So expanding on that a little bit, I heard you speak about when you kind of get stuck in a scale up phase. So you're going and you're maybe having really good growth years, and then you're kind of, like you say, you've maybe hired a bunch of people, but you don't feel like you're getting more productive. Where do you start to look to unpick maybe the processes side of things, and where are those processes holding us up, or they're not fit for purpose, and then eventually breaking through? Have you got any examples of times you've done that?
Yeah, certainly. And just one last comment on our last discussion there, Laura. I would say you want to be speaking to people in the business every week in that model. Not the same people, obviously, but you want to make that a continuous process across the business, because it has, it's necessary to get that sampling rate that allows you to monitor the signal, but also it has a pretty profound impact on the culture of the business that people know you want to know. It will make your middle managers uncomfortable. Why are you talking to my team instead of me? Obviously talk to them as well. So you'll get some resistance to it. But, the worst thing that a senior person can do as company scales is become isolated from the reality of the front line. So, subordinate everything to that. But to your question, how do you get unstuck? So let's just reorientate ourselves to our model here. We've hired a bunch of people for a while. You tend to find, up to about 50 people. As you add people, you get more done, more or less. Then you get to about 50 people, you often find you're adding more people and you're not getting more done. If you get through that point, you tend to find you get to about 100 people, you get another one of these inflection points. You're adding more people, but you're getting less done or less per person. And that will occur again in your future. 200 people, 400. It's almost geometric. So how do you become unstuck? Well, I think the first thing is you've got to emotionally embrace that you are stuck, and that's really hard. You've got momentum in your business, things are going well. Your lagging indicators like revenue, etc., are looking good. You start to sense that people are a bit frustrated, or something's not right, but you don't want to hear that, because things are still going well according to your lagging indicators. The mistakes you make today will show up in those revenue indicators and user number indicators several months from now. And then when things do start to become apparently not working the way they should, or you're stuck, your natural instinct is then to compound that by doubling down on what used to work, as opposed to realizing that, the organization is different now. We're bigger. The structures, processes, skill sets people have are no longer in combination appropriate. So far from doubling down, you need to be changing stuff. So we tend to prolong these getting stuck periods because we're in denial, or because we apply old remedies to a new situation. So what should we do? This is where developing management technique is super important, diagnostic technique. So I'll give just one example of that, so we don't spend the rest of the session on it. A really powerful technique is to ask yourself, where is the current constraint in the business? Let's think about it for a second. Imagine we connected a whole series of pipes together, for water. So thick pipes, thin pipes, middle-sized pipes, all connected in a long snaking path. And we start flowing water through those pipes. Now, if I was to say, what's governing the overall flow rate through these pipes, then most people, especially if they could see this in front of them, would say, well, it's obviously the thinnest pipe. It doesn't matter how thick the other pipes are, how wide they are, what their capacity is. The thinnest pipe in this piping system will throttle the flow of the water. Literally, it's a bottleneck. Now, if I was then to say to you, well, forget that, let's instead look at your product development process, which you can analogize to a whole set of pipe stages of different thicknesses. The thicker the pipe, the faster that stage goes. If I was to say, what's governing the rate of this process, the answer, of course, analogous to our water example, has to be the part of the process that's going most slowly. But again, in business, we tend not to believe that. We tend not to act that way. So you'll very often see situations where, for example, The sales team can sign up customers faster than those customers can be engineer integrated and delivered to. So what you shouldn't do is keep signing up customers. You should stop signing up customers, and you should instead find the reason why, or the slowest point in that integration of customers and delivery of customers process, and widen that bottleneck. But we very rarely do that. We continue to bonus the sales team on ever more sales, or the product team feels successful because it's adding ever more requirements to its feature list. The fact that literally 2% of them can be implemented a year doesn't stop the product people feeling successful, and so on. So, the lesson here is that at any point in time, if you think about the golden processes that run your business, for example, attracting customers / users, delivering the service to those users, and then finally making the improvements in the first two, for example, improving the software or things like that. Most businesses essentially could be described by those three golden processes, and each one of them currently today has something that governs their overall speed at which they operate. If you don't know what that is, then you can't unblock these blockages. So the first thing that I always do when I see a blockage in a business is say, what are your golden processes? Let's sketch them out, or let's use Post-its and stick them on a wall somewhere. And what stage in those processes is currently the slowest, and why do we think that? And do we need to make it go faster? Now, that then raises the question of how do we make it go faster, etc. Depends on the business, but that's a great starting point to unblocking something. So, I mean, I've seen like zillions of examples of this. A bug fixing process that suddenly slowed down dramatically. Why was that? Well, nobody triaged the bugs for 2 weeks after they were raised because they were busy building that new software we asked them to build, or a software release process that took 6 weeks to release the code because it worked well with 3 developers but not with 10. You've got to have that. Where are the flows? Where is the single bottleneck governing the speed of each of those flows? What can we do to elevate it to a faster speed? Where does that then put the new bottleneck? Repeat until you're going fast enough. That's a great starting point. It's not the only story, but it's an indication of a simple technique that anyone can use that brings a lot of systematic insight into why things slow down. There's other similar techniques we can use, but that's a good illustration. One of the most helpful I've found in my career.
Yeah, that is very helpful, and absolutely, I think also then looking, well, where can we further optimise for agency in those processes? So do we have layers of sign off within something, or can it be automated and remove that job for somebody? So yeah, I think spending more time on refining those golden processes. So moving on a bit more to your journey and the growth evolution at Skyscanner and ultimate significant exit within the Scottish technology space. I'm interested in how your leadership and communication evolved over that time. Like we touched on earlier, you're trying to speak to as many people as you can all of the time, but often your direct reports get smaller. Your communication goes from not just us in this room to us across Slack or email or all of these different broadcast channels. So maybe you could talk a little bit to how that evolved over your time at Skyscanner.
Certainly. So I had, obviously Skyscanner not being my first experience of scaling companies, I'd arrived with a very strong sense that there's almost never too much communication. I mean, when people start to complain, as they will, that you're communicating too often, then that's when you're communicating just about enough. So, people immediately forget what you tell them is important. You have to incessantly repeat key messages, as in as many formats and by as many channels as you possibly can. So that's something that I think a lot of executives in a scaling business underappreciate. More than half of your job is communicating what the company has decided is important. So I sort of arrived with that understanding, and that was fine. But I think what I also learned during the journey was, although intellectually I understood this, I emotionally understood it, um, which is that I subsequently emotionally understood it, and that's that communication is bi-directional. You've got to be hearing as much from the business as you are putting out to the business, and that requires you to do those, quite exhausting things like spend a lot of time, apart from your day job, listening to people in forums where they're willing to tell you what they think, which is, not the town hall meeting with 110 people in the room. I think a lot of executives make the mistake that, people want to come and hear what they've got to say, but really, if you had to choose, you want to hear what they've got to say in those forums. So you've got to think about how do you make communication bi-directional, because that will inform your where you think the strategy should go, and when that's disconnected, management generates a lot of strategies, and even if it communicates them well, they just generate cynicism because they're starting to drift from the reality that people are experiencing. So I think my evolution was, I arrived with a good grounding in the need to incessantly communicate, but I left with a well-developed sense that I needed to, be in receive mode as much as I was in transmit mode. And also you've got to make communication interesting. If I could give executives one piece of advice, you are not important. Nothing should happen in the company for your convenience. You should abandon any sense of status that you think your job gives you. You are there to enable the people on your team to be much more effective than if you weren't there. And therefore, be careful you're not doing things like creating a lot of bureaucracy so you can get really nice reports every 24 hours on the state of the business, for example, and regardless of the expense and the distraction to the team. You need to know the reality on the ground as best you possibly can, and then you need to efficiently set priorities that allow people to know which way they should be pointing, and then you've got to engineer an environment where they can be maximally effective. So, for example, if you take your engineering team's time and chop it up into lots of meetings because your managers feel good about getting regular reports, then you've just killed productivity. You've got to really think about this. So a great way to think about it is, if I was in the front line of this business, wherever that may be, maybe I'm going to empathise with marketing this week or customer support next week. What's the reality for those people, and how do I make that 10 times more effective? And that requires your communication style to be much more bi-directional. So that's kind of how my comms philosophy evolved, I guess, as I saw the company grow.
And that is really interesting, and I think we try and create as many channels for that as possible. But as you say, maybe this is worth understanding for me. Every week, were you having these kind of feedback meetings all across the company with all different functions out with the line manager time? Is that something that you were doing?
Every week, even when the company was at about 1,000 employees, I was having such meetings, but not across the entire company every week. So the reality is that in these kind of senior roles, as I'm sure you're well aware, Laura, your time's at a premium. It's very easy to schedule out this time for quotes more important things, like yet another meeting of senior people. But you've got to just protect one or 2 hours a week to meet with people. So how I scaled that was, when the company was like 100 people, it was quite easy to meet with individuals, and that was fine. As it got bigger to like 400 or 500 people, I would do things like meet everybody born, like we're in July at the time of recording this, so everyone born in July. I just, we're in a particular office, I would meet with them, which gave you a great sort of random spread of roles and seniorities. I think another way to do it is when you are brainstorming something, it's extremely important to not do that along functional strata. Like, why are we having trouble with the iPad app, user performance? Let's get all the directors in the room to discuss. Big mistake. You need to get people who have something to say about that topic in the room. So you need to get people super comfortable about having someone who's pretty junior in the room with someone who's pretty senior, and both of those parties need to feel okay about that. Otherwise it's not going to be an effective meeting. But for example, when I was talking earlier about how do you find bottlenecks, well, you do that by getting if you think about a complex process, might be your kind of billing reconciliation at the end of the month, might be your product development process. You have to have people in the room who operate a part of that process. And you also have someone senior enough in the room to be able to affect change in that process. But what you shouldn't do, and what we often do, is have a senior leadership offsite to discuss that stuff. You can certainly do that for more high level strategic directional things. But I always err on the side of having a mixed group of people with different experiences, because they're the people together understand the problem. So, two things there. One is meet with people and ask them what they think of the business. But secondly, don't waste an opportunity to mix it up when you are having your normal sort of executive deep dives into how things work or don't work.
Yeah, and I think that diversity of thought in terms of problem solving, you're always just blown away by the insight that people have who are much closer to the problem when you think because you've built the business over the years, but actually you really kind of lose sight of that. I completely agree on that side. I wonder, how did you deal with, if you would have these meetings all across the company with different functions? I would sometimes get feedback like something's brought up in those meetings, but you can't necessarily do something about it. But someone feels it's been raised maybe to leadership and something should be done about it. Would you communicate that back openly or individual level? I think sometimes you don't want to override a manager's decision, and sometimes I worry that creates a different level that then something should be done because it's gone up to leadership. So that's something I think I've struggled with. I'd be interested to get your perspective.
Well, I think it's always important to set the ground rules for the communication at the start. So if I've given you the impression I'm going to close the loop with you on this point, I need to close the loop. So if you've said, there's, what would be an example? There's just a lack of focus on ensuring that our marketing content is sufficiently well presented in terms of professional standards. I'm going to have to close the loop on that. And that might require me to go to the manager in between and say, I'm hearing this. I don't know if it's right, but I think you need to reassure me that it's not an issue. I think you need to close the loop with the person I've spoken to. Although that might make someone uncomfortable, you've got to close that loop. There may be other situations where, and I've certainly done this, where someone gives me feedback and say, look, I don't know if what you're saying is correct. Like everybody hates the design team. They just don't work well with others. I'd still have some flags raised there in my own mind as to, is this just somebody who doesn't like somebody in the design team, etc. So I would say, that's something that I'm going to note, but I'm not necessarily going to take it face value with, I hope you're not offended by that. If I felt that there was a pattern there, I might do otherwise. So you just got to set the ground rules to your communications. And it's important that you don't take seriously everything you hear in those kind of communications. I mean, I'll give you a good example. When I was at the other side of this fence, as it were, I remember when I was a 22-year-old software engineer, and I was working on a really big C program that was just a mess. I was one of my early roles in a business. I was one of the bug fixing team on this software. In those days, we had a bad model where people didn't fix their own bugs. You gave it to the juniors to fix, which creates bad habits. But anyway, I and my other sort of young bug fixing colleagues knew that this product was never going to ship because we lived in the code every day. Now, every quarter, the most senior managers in the very large company I was in would come to our senior managers on our site and discuss why is this still behind schedule and when's it going to get addressed. And they never asked us ever what we thought, which was a shame because I could have told them, well, it's just never going to scale. It's just the company had bought this software from another company, had taken on the maintenance of it, and they shouldn't have, and it was just like a mess. Now, at the same time, I couldn't have told that a senior executive how to fix the situation organisationally because I didn't understand the organisation. I didn't know who did what. I just didn't have the visibility, especially in those days where there were no intranets, etc. So, what's my point there? My point is I had a valuable insight, and at the same time, I couldn't have told that senior manager how to correct that issue. So but I probably had a good try from my myopic position. So it's important to, context stuff, and it's important to be honest with people that you're going to context what they say, and sometimes you're going to act on it, and sometimes you're going to take it as a kind of background, signal that you're going to pay attention to along with other signals. And I think people will respect that. They might, not always appreciate it, but they'll appreciate you being honest with them.
Yeah. And did you find, so you get the feedback and then maybe when you bring that back to the line manager level, I think I've struggled with the balance between optimise for agency, hear something, bring it back, and then that can feel like micromanaging or not optimising for agency, and those two are kind of fighting against each other. Is it just framing that conversation, making sure everybody's aware? Because I feel sometimes that's where the push-pull comes from sometimes.
Yeah, I think, part of what we're talking about here is a different culture as how organisations run. Now, it's being careful not to generalise here, but it's very often the case that as bad news moves through layers of management, it becomes good news. And we've seen that in history, because the closer you get to senior people, the more pressure is to give good news, and it's very difficult for the most senior people in the company to prevent that from happening. So you've got to ask yourself, how isolated do I want to be from the reality, the dirty, muddy, imprecise, myopic reality? How insulated do I want to be? And I think the answer is you want to trust the management line to do its job. That's about pushing responsibility out. But you also want, because the company's future depends on it, and so does your job depend on it, you want to verify that from a number of angles. You don't want to find out that, the sales team was saying for ages that people just don't want to buy this stuff anymore. But you didn't get that message because in the rolled up annual report, the lagging indicators hadn't revealed that yet. And no one had told you because, well, they wanted to make sure they got their bonus for that quarter, or they were just afraid to tell you because they're a bit intimidated by you, or something like that. So I think I always remember the famous words of Ronald Reagan when he was going through nuclear arms reduction talks between America and the Soviet Union. And, there was a question from a reporter about, you say you trust Mr. Gorbachev, but you're insisting on inspections. So, is it trust or is it not? And his answer was trust but verify. And I think there's that in the complexity of life, I think that's a useful way to look at it. And if that's your culture, then people will learn to live with that culture, or they'll leave your business. But they have to accept that's your culture. That was my thinking. Now, management is not easy, and as you've correctly identified by your comments, Laura, this is not an easy thing to do, right? And you've got to be careful. On one hand, you don't switch off from the front line of the business. On the other hand, you don't, upset all your very hardworking, talented sort of senior managers. So you've got to explain yourself everywhere you go. and you've got to be intelligent about how you do that. So I'm not saying it's easy, but what I am saying is as you scale a business, the worst thing that can happen to a senior leader is to become isolated from the reality. Because then you beg the question, why are you in the business? Because you've got a lot of agency to change things. But if you're afraid to use that agency because you're ignorant of the business's current status, or it's only one dimensional coming through the functional hierarchy, that's problematic.
Yeah, that's very helpful. So moving on to the scale up ecosystem in Scotland, you are Chief Entrepreneurial Advisor to the Scottish Government. How are you seeing Scottish scale ups grow, evolve? What's your read on the ecosystem, and what more could we be doing to support business?
So, it's commonly said that Scotland doesn't have enough scale ups, and I think that's true. The more important question is, how do we get more? And the way I think about that is that we need to think about the Scottish tech ecosystem, that environment of companies of different sizes, of sort of resources to help them, spaces for companies to go, funding, etc. That's a set of components. We need to think about it as a system. So it has an input, which is talent, and it's an output, which is scaling companies. And we've got some levers we can pull. And those levers are, firstly, ensuring that we've got the sufficient level of talent going into the ecosystem, and that talent is properly equipped at different levels of scale. So, for example, how do we educate our startup founders to know how to scale a company would be one example of that. Second lever we have is infrastructure, which I would divide into physical infrastructure and social infrastructure. So places to start and grow companies, places to manufacture deep tech products, for example, but also social infrastructure. So that, network of founders and others who can support each other, learn from each other, hire from each other, etc. That's super important. So that's about stimulating great conferences in Scotland, attracting experienced people to Scotland, and so on. Then finally, there's the funding lever. And I think that we sometimes make the mistake of saying, well, the problem is there's not enough funding in Scotland, therefore, if there was, we'd do more. And that is partly true, but consider if someone arrived with £1 billion today and said, okay, we wanted to invest it, we'd struggle to get that money away in Scotland today. So it's better to start, I would say, at the ensuring our founders have the skills they need and have the talent around them, and that they've got places to start those companies and grow them and demonstrate their capability, which will then attract a lot more investment and will attract it to places that can be consumed efficiently and effectively. So what we're trying to do, and I say we, it's like a lot of stakeholders across, public and private institutions, is create the great infrastructure, create a great educational environment for our founders. And what will happen is we'll end up with more early stage companies, and more of them will get to scale, and more of those scale companies will get to higher scale. So it's like a funnel. It shrinks, lots of really small companies, and then the funnel shrinks as you go towards unicorns and beyond, if you like. Not every company should try and become a unicorn, absolutely not. But every company in Scotland should be able to get to its natural level of scale, where they've gotten to in a larger ecosystem. And our job is to ensure by the right application of interventions across those three areas I mentioned, education, infrastructure and funding, that the funnel doesn't narrow too quickly. So that's why we have initiatives like, for example, TechScaler, which is sites all around Scotland to incubate startups, but crucially, it combines that with intensive founder education, with 100 entrepreneurs in residence or mentors, etc. It's to address those priorities. And if we get that right, funding will come, and is my conviction.
Yeah. And I think the other part to that is the networks that you have access to when you build these kind of founder groups. So having been in Scale Up Scotland and kind of, as you say, going through that funnel of the first one, the second one, there's now a pre-scaler just to kind of widen that funnel. For us, I think going through that, the network that we then built around us, because I think the founder challenges that are quite unique, like it's a very unique set of circumstances, and to have a group of 30 or 50 people who are all in it together, whether it's funding challenges, issues in teams, or whatever it is, I've seen every different variation of those problems, and people share quite quickly because it's quite a unique group, and I think it builds trust in a really short space of time with a group of people that you would never have maybe placed yourself with. So that was the unseen bit for me. I think I went into it with maybe building skill set and building, hearing from great speakers and all of those things. And probably the strongest thing has been the peer network that's come out of it.
Yeah, I think you've illustrated really powerfully the importance of those social networks. I remember in Skyscanner, Gareth Williams, who was my boss, and he was the founder of Skyscanner. He used to say that you should never invite consultants into your business. You should only learn from peers or people who are a few steps ahead of your level of scale. And, I think that was it might be an obvious statement, but I think it was very insightful because, you really, the people who are going through what you're going through or have gone through recently what you're going through are probably able to give you the most real world advice. And they don't give that advice lightly because for them it was life or death for their company. So it's not just about billing you or things they read on ChatGPT, etc. So I think what you've just described is a great example of that. Having access to that network gives you confidence, gives you direct experience, gives you access to sell further contacts. So that's why I think that network is important. And I know a lot of people listening to this might immediately kind of wince at that because a lot of us in tech, for example, are a bit introverted, I include myself in that. An idea of networking, it conjures up visions of, sidling up to people in cocktail bars and, giving them your business card or something like that. And I think that's a very difficult thing for a lot of people to do. The best definition of networking I ever received was helping other people when you don't need their help. And, that tends to pay you back later. So there's lots of different ways you can do that from, your desk at home or, in other ways, one-to-one conversations, but finding ways to distill and share lessons with other people will pay you back 100-fold. So yeah, that's how I think we can personally activate what you're saying. But at the grander scale of the ecosystem as a whole, we should never underestimate the importance of those strong, cohesive founder networks. And we need to attach those networks to learning outside Scotland as well. That's extremely important.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's taken me a long time to realise there is no bad time spent networking. Like probably earlier stage, I was always looking for an outcome quite quickly. And actually over time, I've realised that the best thing is to help somebody that's maybe on their path or their journey or something that you've been through. And over time, it does pay back. But I think it took a while to learn. But yeah, something I spend a huge amount of time doing and trying to support other people. And definitely we've all saved each other from some horror stories. So moving on, you also are working on Pathways, which is a new approach for women in entrepreneurship and trying to improve gender balance in startups and scale-ups and probably business in general. And it's something I'm really close to as a female founder. I'm interested probably in how what you're seeing is working there, and where do you think more focus has to go?
Yeah, I think this takes us to the territory of what type of improvement do we want? And we talked earlier about optimizing processes, etc. I'm a great believer in the idea that dramatic improvement is often possible without dramatic action. We tend to condition ourselves to believe that a big problem needs a big solution, so we shy away from big problems and just do displacement work and solve small stuff. The issue of female underrepresentation in entrepreneurship is a big problem which we need to believe is solvable. We need to believe dramatic improvement is possible. And I think the problem is that we don't believe that right now as a society. So we celebrate like really small incremental improvements. We intend to have more female directors. We're going to have, well, how many are you going to have? We're going to have, 2% more over the next 5 years, and 2% of a really, really small number is a really, really small number. And people expect, plaudits for those kind of things. So I think we need dramatic improvement in this area, and we need to believe that that's possible. That requires us then to say, well, why are we in this situation? And it requires us to confront taboos that we don't like to confront. The reason that there's a very small representation in entrepreneurship amongst female founders is because our society is a highly sexist, right? From the earliest age, we ingrain it in our children, gender stereotypes that say boys do this, girls do that. Parents repeatedly in tests will overestimate the IQ of their male children and underestimate the IQ of their female children. So they are already in the process of educating their children to continue these gender stereotypes. So if you don't talk about it in society, you're unlikely to change it, and it informs everything. Of course, as you'll be very well aware, Laura, this doesn't just apply to entrepreneurship. So I would like us to, as a society, be talking about this and set the goal of approximately equal participation instead of let's make things a little bit better. And therefore, I'm not satisfied that we're doing that yet. I'm not satisfied that government's doing that. I'm not satisfied that industry's doing that. I find International Women's Day on LinkedIn a fairly disappointing day because someone's managed to find the female engineer in their team and have a photograph of them in LinkedIn and then expect again to be sort of thanked for that. I think we're not having a real debate about why don't we have 50-50 participation. Now, what have we seen since Pathways was published? Well, something I have been very encouraged by is that Anna, my co-author, Anna Stewart, has established a movement called Pathways Forward, and Pathways Forward is about saying, well, yeah, the report was for government to do the things it can do, but what about industry? What are you doing? Are you implementing pathways inside your organisations? And there's been a very strong response in Scotland, much stronger than I think we expected to that. And we now have this thing called the Pathways Pledge, where companies are signing up and saying, this is what we are going to change in organisation over the next 12 months to start to move towards the Pathways Pledges. So a great example is the Scottish National Investment Bank, who have said that over the 3 years, they're going to ensure that they only invest in companies that have, or invest alongside other investment companies where at least 20% of the senior partners are female. That, in an industry where there's very, very few investment partners who are female, that's quite a statement for them to make. And, they are acting with every intent of fulfilling that. So I think we are starting to see a dialogue in Scotland, which is encouraging. But Scotland, let's go faster and further. Let's not assume that a massive gender imbalance is normal. Let's start every conversation in every business and every institution from why is it not 50-50? There might be good reasons for that, but let's start there. And let's challenge ourselves to meet those goals. And while we're at it, why Scotland has not passed the misogyny law, I'm still flummoxed by, because if you tolerate extreme sexism and misogyny in society, you'll tolerate other forms of sexism. So, let's get serious and let's get on with this. Would be my view. So we're making some progress, but I fear incremental progress masquerading as big progress. So let's have that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, like you say, have the conversation, bring awareness, and I see more brings more. So the more women you have, the more female founders, the more women on stage. I really do believe in the power of that role modeling and how you see other women who are a bit ahead of you, but just a few steps, and puts you in that position. And I know from just my immediate circle how much influence we can all have on each other. But yeah, it needs to 10x it as opposed to these percentages. Okay, so our last topic for today is more just a comment on how you think Scotland is faring in terms of the AI space. I recently learned that Edinburgh University is the oldest AI department in the world, which was news to me, and we should be ripe for that kind of development. But I'm interested in your take on where we are in that space.
Well, I think we're not doing as well as we could, given the quality of our university sector in this country. Per capita, according to the QS World Rankings, which is probably the major survey of universities worldwide, it's certainly one of the top three. Scotland still has per capita the highest concentration of world-class universities anywhere on earth. So that's quite impressive. We don't maybe talk about that as much as we should. Now, do we feel honestly that we are converting that asset's full potential towards driving our tech economy? No, of course we're not. So I think that doesn't just apply to AI, it applies to deep tech in general. We're doing great research. We're creating quite a lot of spin-outs, but we're not seeing these dominant companies come through in Scotland. So I think we need to do a lot more there. So what does that involve? Well, aside from the work that's already getting done as a result of things like the Scottish Technology Ecosystem Review, things like TechScaler, etc., a project I'm really excited about and interested in just now is the establishment of what I'd call deep tech manufacturing pathways. So let's say, for example, you walk around the Robotarium at Heriot Watt. Lots of great companies in there doing really interesting stuff, which combines robotics and AI. I mean, AI we should think of now more as like electricity. A lot of things use electricity. It's going to be less and less applied just on its own, and more embedded in other technologies. And the trouble is, those robotics companies currently have nowhere to go in Scotland from once they've finished prototyping. So can we create, like an analogous to the TechScaler network, limited scale manufacturing, high tech sites around Scotland where people can access shared process expertise and shared spaces to build assembly lines for their first 1,000 items, so they can iterate and improve those products, and they can test the markets, etc. Can we create those kind of pathways towards large-scale manufacture? These are the sort of infrastructural plays we need to find a way to make in Scotland, regardless of the budgetary conditions that we find ourselves in, if we're really to convert our great research into great deep tech, which will include AI. So I think we can do those things. I think we need to do them before we'll properly, I think, realise the potential of that asset that we have. And I think that's going to be a non-linear thing, because if our universities today knew that such pathways existed, they would make different decisions. People would come up with new startup ideas that it's not worth doing today because there's not a pathway beyond university in Scotland for those. So, there's really the kind of amplificational flywheels that we can get running once we start to put some of these elements in place. So I think we're doing okay, but why don't we just, believe in better, if I can borrow a catchphrase from a well-known telecoms company.
Yeah, yeah. I think it is. It's the mindset sometimes that we can do something on a much bigger scale. I think we can be guilty of that kind of more incremental mindset in general. And actually, it's how do we build these same level of companies and, like you say, more creative infrastructures and bringing a few startups together to create more efficient companies at the beginning. So I think that makes complete sense. And just lastly, are there any other countries that you think have built that infrastructure really well, coming from university into industry, and maybe a smoother flow through that pipe? If we, it seems like we have the talent, but it's maybe not all developing into the ecosystem that we would expect. So anyone you think does it really well?
Yeah, there's lots of countries of comparable size to Scotland that do it really well. Stockholm University has had 12 unicorn companies, which is, I think, 4 times more than the whole of Scotland. So That's one data point. Estonia, 1.3 million population, 3 unicorns. And I'm not using unicorn as the end goal. I'm using it just as a crude proxy for scaling deep tech and tech companies. Finland is another great example. 5.3 million people, fantastic tech economy. Lots of great startups going to scale there. And the thing they have in common is a thoughtful, consistent, multi-year approach to building out a tech ecosystem. And that's what we've got to do in Scotland. And we are doing that right now. We could do it faster and better with more funding. But the most important thing is that we maintain a consistent philosophy over those years. So we don't do things in isolation of each other, compete with each other, things that we're often very good at doing in Scotland. We need to kind of join up our efforts and use the assets that we have, connect them together into an ecosystem fabric that's similar to those countries' fabrics. And then investment starts to flow into the country. So I think that's the journey we're on, and I'm pretty excited about it. We're doing quite well in Scotland, but we could do much better. So we're not doing terribly. So let's not be despondent and all that stuff. But I think there's a rising belief in Scotland that we can do an awful lot better, and that there's a pathway to doing that. And that pathway is lit by countries, not very far from here, that have already done something similar. So let's learn from them, adapt and apply it here. And I think we'll see some amazing results over the next 5 years. So that's what I'm trying to contribute to us doing.
Excellent. Well, thank you for all that you're doing for entrepreneurs, businesses, and the ecosystem in Scotland. So thank you for giving us your time today. That's been hugely insightful, and I'm sure the audience will love it. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Laura. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Tag Lab. I really hope you enjoyed it. Please make sure that you subscribe by hitting follow on whatever podcast platform you listen to so you can get the latest episode. Thanks.